Yusuf had spent his entire life dedicated to the service of Allah, believing that he was walking the only true path. From a young age, he had memorized the Quran, studied the Hadiths, and immersed himself in Islamic teachings with unwavering devotion. As an imam, he led prayers, guided his community in matters of faith, and fiercely defended Islam against those who challenged it. Christianity, to him, was nothing more than a corrupted faith riddled with falsehoods. Jesus was merely a prophet, a man sent by God like many others before him. To claim that Jesus was divine, the Son of God, was the greatest blasphemy he could imagine. He was certain of the truth he upheld until everything changed. It began as a simple illness, a persistent cough that he dismissed as nothing serious. But as the days passed, his condition worsened rapidly. His strength faded, his breathing became labored, and despite the prayers of his family and congregation, his body failed to respond. Doctors diagnosed him with severe pneumonia, and soon he found himself lying in a hospital bed, struggling to hold on to life. As he gasped for air, surrounded by his terrified wife and children, a chilling thought crossed his mind. What if he was wrong? He had always preached about the certainty of faith, but now, standing at the threshold of death, doubt crept into his heart. And as his vision darkened, he felt his soul slipping away into the unknown. As his consciousness faded, Yusuf fully expected to awaken in the presence of Allah, surrounded by angels ready to question him about his faith. He had spoken about this moment countless times, reassuring his congregation that death was simply a transition to the next stage of existence. But as he drifted away, what came next was nothing like he had imagined. He was not greeted by celestial beings, nor did he find himself in a state of divine peace. Instead, he became aware of an eerie silence, a vast emptiness stretching endlessly in every direction. Was weightless, yet he existed. There was no ground beneath him, no sky above, just an infinite void. He waited for the angels of questioning, for any sign of Allah's presence, but nothing came. A deep unease settled within him. Something was terribly wrong. Then the whispers began. At first they were distant, like echoes carried on an invisible wind. He couldn't make out the words, but their presence sent chills through whatever remained of his being. Suddenly, shadowy figures emerged from the void, shifting and twisting like smoke. They had no defined form, yet their presence was undeniable. The whispers grew louder, creeping into his mind, filling him with a sense of dread unlike anything he had ever known. He had always believed in the unseen world, spirits, jinn, but this was something far worse. The voices became words, spoken in a language he did not understand, yet their meaning burned into his soul. Lies, deception. You were blind. He tried to call upon Allah to recite the Shahada, but his voice was gone. The figures pressed in closer, suffocating him with a spiritual weight he could not resist. Just as the darkness seemed ready to consume him, a brilliant light erupted in the void. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. Blinding yet not painful, overwhelming yet filled with an indescribable warmth. The shadowy figures recoiled, their whispers turning into agonized shrieks as they fled from the radiance. The suffocating weight vanished, replaced by an authority, so powerful it made the entire space tremble. And then, from within the light, a figure stepped forward. Yusuf's entire being trembled. He knew who it was before he even saw his face, but it couldn't be. It shouldn't be. And yet, it was. It was Jesus. Yusuf's mind rejected it instantly. His entire life had been spent refuting the claim that Jesus was anything more than a prophet. He had debated Christians, dismantled their arguments, and confidently dismissed their belief that Jesus was divine. But now, as he stood before the radiant presence, every fiber of his being screamed that this was real. Jesus was not just a messenger. He was something far greater. The weight of this realization crushed him. He wanted to argue, to deny what he was seeing, to hold on to everything he had believed. But he couldn't. The truth was standing in front of him, and it was undeniable. Jesus looked into his eyes, and in that moment, Yusuf felt completely exposed, as if every thought, every belief, every doubt had been laid bare before him. Yusuf fell to his knees, unable to withstand the sheer authority and presence of Jesus. His very soul trembled under the weight of the moment. He had spent his life proclaiming that Jesus was just a man, a prophet no different from the others. But now, confronted with the undeniable reality of who Jesus truly was, all of his arguments, all of his confidence, all of his teachings collapsed in an instant. He wanted to look away, to shield himself from the overwhelming radiance, but he couldn't. The light was not just something to be seen, it was something that pierced through him, revealing every truth he had refused to acknowledge. Then Jesus spoke. Yusuf. His voice was unlike anything Yusuf had ever heard. It did not simply fill the air, it filled him, resonating in the depths of his being. It carried power, authority, and love, a love so pure it made him feel as if every wall he had ever built around his heart was being torn down. He tried to respond, but his voice failed him. His thoughts were tangled, caught between resistance and realization, between fear and revelation. "This cannot be," he finally managed to whisper. "I was faithful. I followed the truth. I obeyed God." His words felt hollow even as he spoke them. For the first time in his life, he doubted everything he had ever believed. Jesus took a step closer, and the light around him pulsed with a warmth that reached deep into Yusuf's soul. It was as if truth itself was alive, pressing against every falsehood he had clung to for years. Yusuf wanted to resist, to hold on to what he had always believed, but something inside him was breaking apart, shattering under the weight of what he now knew to be real. "You sought truth," Jesus said, his voice both gentle and unwavering, "but you were blind to the one standing before you." A sharp pain shot through Yusuf, not physical, but something deeper, something in his very spirit. He shook his head in desperation. "No, no," he muttered. "I followed the path given to me. I did what I was taught. I defended God against falsehoods." His voice trailed off as the weight of his own words sank in. He had spent his entire life defending what he thought was truth, never once questioning if he had actually found it. Jesus' gaze never wavered. "You defended what you believed to be true," he said, "but truth is not found in words alone. It is found in me." The words struck Yusuf like lightning, reverberating through his very soul. His mind raced, struggling to reconcile everything he had been taught with what he was now experiencing. "But I was taught that you are only a prophet," he whispered, his voice trembling. "A man sent by God, not God himself." The moment the words left his lips, Jesus asked him a question that shattered every last remnant of his resistance. "Who do you say that I am?" The question struck Yusuf like a thunderclap, echoing through his soul. It was the same question Jesus had asked his disciples long ago, the same question that had divided those who followed him from those who rejected him. Now it was being asked of him. He wanted to argue, to resist, to hold on to the teachings he had spent his life defending. But as he looked into Jesus' eyes, he realized that he already knew the answer. Every argument he had ever made, every debate he had ever won, every certainty he had ever clung to, it all crumbled in that moment. Because in the presence of Jesus, he could not deny the truth. This was no mere prophet, no simple messenger. This was God himself standing before him, and Yusuf had spent his entire life rejecting him. The weight of that realization crushed him. His knees buckled, and he collapsed, overwhelmed by the truth that had been hidden from him for so long. Tears burned in his eyes, but he couldn't look away. He had been wrong, so terribly, completely wrong. Yusuf's breath came in ragged gasps as the weight of truth settled upon him. He had spent his life teaching others that Jesus was merely a prophet, nothing more. He had debated, argued, and dismissed the idea of his divinity as blasphemy. Yet now, standing before the undeniable presence of Jesus, every belief he had ever held collapsed like sand slipping through his fingers. The reality was overwhelming. He had been blind his entire life. Jesus reached out his hand, and Yusuf felt an invitation, not of force, but of love. "Come," Jesus said, his voice filled with a compassion Yusuf had never known. "Let me show you what is coming next." There was no condemnation, no anger, only an offer to see the truth in full. Without hesitation, Yusuf reached out and took his hand. The moment he did, everything around him shifted, as if a veil had been lifted, and suddenly he was no longer standing in the void. In an instant, Yusuf found himself hovering above the earth, weightless, as if time itself had been stripped away. He looked down and saw the Middle East. Spread out beneath him, the lands he had known so well, the cities where he had preached, the places that had shaped his faith. But now he was seeing them through different eyes. Something was terribly wrong. The streets were in turmoil, filled with unrest, riots and destruction. Smoke rose from the cities, and people ran in fear, their faces twisted with confusion and despair. There was no peace. He turned to Jesus, his voice weak. "Why is this happening?" Jesus' gaze was sorrowful as he looked down at the chaos. "Because they have turned away from the truth," he said. Yusuf's heart pounded as he took in what he had never seen before, the true nature of the battle. At first, he thought it was political conflicts, wars between nations, struggles over land and power. But then, his eyes were opened further. Behind the governments, behind the armies, behind the religious leaders, he saw something else. Dark figures moving in the shadows. They whispered into the ears of rulers, fueled division between peoples, and spread deception among those who thought they were serving God. This was not just war. This was a spiritual battle for souls. Yusuf's eyes widened as he saw the dark forces at work, their presence unseen by human eyes, yet influencing everything. These were not ordinary conflicts. They were orchestrated by something far greater, far darker. He saw demons standing behind kings, presidents, and generals, whispering into their ears, feeding them lies, convincing them that war was the only answer. He saw governments being manipulated, their leaders blinded by pride, greed, and the hunger for power. He had always believed that men ruled the world, but now he saw the truth. There were greater forces pulling the strings. His gaze then turned toward the religious institutions, and what he saw chilled him to the core. He had expected to see the presence of God in these places, to feel the weight of true worship, but instead he felt nothing. He saw Christian churches filled with thousands of people, their preachers standing on grand stages, but their messages were empty. They spoke of blessings, of prosperity, of self-improvement, but never of repentance, never of truth. The people clapped, cheered, and left feeling entertained, but their souls remained starved. Then he saw mosques packed with devoted men bowing in prayer, reciting verses they had memorized since childhood. But behind them, he saw chains on their souls, on their minds, on their hearts. They had been taught never to question, never to seek beyond what they had been given. They thought they were drawing closer to God, but in reality, they were moving further away. Tears welled in Yusuf's eyes as he watched the deception unfold before him. How could so many people be so blind? He had spent his life believing he was serving God, leading others in faith, yet now he saw that he had only been reinforcing the chains that bound them. He saw religious leaders, both Christian and Muslim, standing before massive crowds, their voices passionate, their words carefully chosen. But as he looked closer, he saw what they could not, dark figures standing behind them, whispering into their ears, twisting their messages, ensuring that people never found the true path. Some leaders were bound by pride, others by fear, some by power and greed. They thought they were leading people to God, but they were keeping them from Him. Yusuf turned to Jesus, his voice barely above a whisper. "But they are sincere." His words caught in his throat. "They believe they are doing what is right." Jesus nodded, sorrow filling his expression. "Sincerity does not make something true." The words struck Yusuf deeply. He had been sincere, he had been devoted, yet he had been wrong. He had memorized scriptures, led prayers, debated others, but he had never truly known God. How many others were trapped, just as he had been? His heart ached as he realized the magnitude of what was happening. People weren't just misled, they were being held captive by a system designed to keep them from asking the one question that could set them free. Yusuf's knees weakened as the weight of reality crushed him. He had spent his life defending what he thought was truth, never realizing that he was just another prisoner in a system designed to keep him blind. He looked again at the world below him, now understanding that this was more than a battle between religions, more than a struggle for power or influence. This was a war for souls. And the enemy's greatest weapon was deception. Keep them busy, keep them afraid, keep them believing they already have the truth. That was how the forces of darkness worked. He could see it now. Millions, even billions of people caught in an endless cycle of traditions, rituals, and empty words, never actually knowing the one they claimed to serve. Then Jesus lifted his hand, and Yusuf's vision shifted again. He saw people in secret meetings, whispering prayers in hidden rooms. He saw men and women gathered around tattered Bibles, reading the words of Jesus by candlelight, afraid of being discovered. He saw Christians being beaten, imprisoned, even executed for their faith, but they would not deny him. He saw Muslims, Jews, Hindus, atheists, all searching, questioning, longing for truth. And then he saw something even more powerful. The enemy was fighting them. While the dark forces allowed empty religion to flourish, they waged war against those who found the truth. Those who clung to Jesus were the ones who suffered most. Yusuf watched as Christians were dragged from their homes, beaten in the streets, and thrown into prison cells. Yet they did not break. He saw a young woman, bruised and bloodied, whispering the name of Jesus even as her persecutors struck her. He saw a man, his hands bound, refusing to deny his faith as he faced execution. The world saw their suffering, but in the spirit, he saw their victory. The more they were attacked, the brighter their faith burned. He turned to Jesus, his voice shaking. "Why are they the ones who suffer?" Jesus' expression was solemn, but filled with unwavering strength. "Because the enemy does not fear religion, he fears the truth." The words struck Yusuf like a hammer. That was the key. The forces of darkness did not wage war against empty rituals, false doctrines, or lifeless traditions. They waged war against those who found Jesus. He looked again and saw underground churches, hidden gatherings of former Muslims, Jews, and atheists who had come to Christ. They met in secret, but their faith was unshakable. They had lost their families, their homes, even their lives, yet they would not let go of the truth. The real war was not between religions. It was between deception and revelation, and the world was blind to it. Yusuf's heart pounded as he absorbed the truth. The enemy did not fight those who were lost. He fought those who had been found. He saw it clearly. Now, religion without truth was no threat to darkness. The greatest deception was not in the outright rejection of God, but in the illusion of knowing him while still being blind. The world was filled with false security, people convinced they were following the right path simply because they followed traditions, recited prayers, or obeyed rules. But without Jesus, there was no life. And those who had found him, they were the ones the enemy sought to destroy. Then Jesus stretched out his hand again, and Yusuf's vision changed once more. This time he saw the future. He saw a time coming when the deception would grow even stronger. Nations would turn against true believers. Governments would label them as threats. Religious institutions would merge under a single system, proclaiming that all faiths lead to the same God. Many, even those who once claimed to follow Jesus, would believe the lie. And then he saw war. A war not of land or power, but of souls. Darkness would try to silence the last remnant of those who held on to the truth. The choice would be clear: compromise or face the consequences. Yusef's chest tightened as he witnessed the future unfolding before him. Churches that once stood for truth would fall into compromise. Some would embrace a diluted gospel, one that avoided speaking of sin, repentance, or the exclusive nature of Christ. Others would ally themselves with political and religious movements, preaching unity at the cost of truth. He saw men and women who had once boldly proclaimed Jesus now denying him for the sake of acceptance, and those who refused to bow to the deception. They would be hunted, silenced, and cast out. The world would call them extremists, intolerant, even dangerous, but in reality, they would be the last voices speaking truth in a world drowning in lies. Yusef turned to Jesus, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is there no hope?" Jesus placed a hand on his shoulder, and in an instant, the vision shifted once again. Instead of war and deception, Yusef now saw pockets of light scattered across the darkness. He saw people waking up, questioning, searching for truth. He saw Muslims, Jews, Hindus, atheists, all coming to Jesus. He saw underground churches multiplying, secret gatherings growing, and revival breaking out in the most unexpected places. The world would hate them. The enemy would rage against them, but the truth could not be silenced. Yusef watched in awe as revival spread like wildfire in places where Christianity was forbidden. He saw young men and women secretly reading the Bible, their hands trembling as they flipped through its pages, knowing that discovery could mean death. He saw former imams and scholars standing before small groups, reading from the Gospels, their voices filled with conviction. These were men who had once defended Islam with all their strength, but now they preached the very truth they had once rejected. He saw families gathered in hidden rooms, whispering prayers, baptizing one another in secret, knowing that what they had found was worth any price. No matter how much they were persecuted, the movement only grew stronger. Tears filled Yusef's eyes as he realized that what he had once believed to be a Western religion had nothing to do with culture or geography. Christianity was not dying. It was rising in the places where it was least expected. He saw Muslims and Jews standing side by side, worshipping Jesus as one. He saw former enemies embracing as brothers, no longer divided by race, nation, or tradition. This was the true kingdom of God, one that could not be conquered by governments, silenced by persecution, or erased by deception. The world did not see it, but in the spirit it was growing, unstoppable. Yusef fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the power and beauty of what he was witnessing. This was not about a religion, a culture, or a people. It was about a kingdom that transcended borders, traditions, and history. He saw how, even in the darkest corners of the earth, Jesus was calling people to himself. He saw prisoners whispering his name in the solitude of their cells, refugees carrying the gospel into lands where it had never been preached, and persecuted believers standing firm even as they faced death. The world thought Christianity was fading, but in reality, it was alive in ways no one could imagine. Then Jesus turned to Yusef, his expression both serious and full of love. "But the time is short," he said. Yusef felt those words like a weight on his chest. The enemy knew his time was running out, and that was why he was fighting so hard. The deception would increase. The persecution would grow more intense. Many would fall away. But the gospel would continue to spread, reaching those who were truly seeking. There was still time, but soon a choice would have to be made. Yusef's heart pounded as the weight of Jesus' words settled upon him. A choice was coming, one that would separate those who truly followed him from those who merely claimed to. He saw a time when believers would be forced to decide, compromise for the sake of safety and acceptance, or stand firm and face the consequences. The world would grow more hostile, branding the truth as intolerance, persecuting those who refused to conform. Even those who once claimed faith would turn away, unwilling to suffer for what they did not truly believe. Yet, in the midst of this great falling away, a remnant would remain. They would not bow. They would not be silenced. Jesus' gaze met Yusef's, and in that instant he understood what was being asked of him. He had seen the truth. He had witnessed the deception, the battle for souls, and the awakening happening in the shadows. Now he had a choice. Would he stay safe in the presence of Christ or return to the world, a world that would reject, persecute, and possibly even kill him for what he now knew? He swallowed hard, his body trembling. He had already lost everything, his beliefs, his certainty, his very identity. But if he stayed silent, how many more would remain in darkness? Yusef lowered his head, his thoughts racing. He had died. He had seen the truth. If he returned, his life would never be the same. His family would reject him, his community would cast him out, and his very existence would be threatened. But how could he stay, knowing what he now knew? He thought of his wife, his children, his students, the people who had trusted him, who looked to him for guidance. They were still blind. They still believed as he once had. If he did not return to tell them, who would? He clenched his fists, forcing himself to look back at Jesus. If I go back, will they believe me? His voice was barely above a whisper. Jesus did not answer with words. Instead, he lifted his hand, and a new vision unfolded before Yusef's eyes. He saw himself standing before his family, trying to explain what had happened. He saw the doubt in their eyes, the fear, the hesitation. Some listened, but others turned away. He saw his community reacting with anger, calling him a liar, a blasphemer. He saw leaders denouncing him, condemning him, warning others to stay away. He saw friends abandon him, former students refuse to speak his name. But then he saw something else. He saw a man sitting alone, reading the gospel in secret. He saw a woman kneeling in prayer, whispering the name of Jesus for the first time. He saw lives changing, not all, not even many, but some. And even one was worth it. Tears streamed down Yusef's face as he realized what this meant. His return would come at a cost. He would be hated, persecuted, and possibly even killed. But some would listen. Some would seek the truth. Some would find Jesus just as he had. And if even one soul was saved, would it not be worth it? His entire life, he had believed he was leading people to God. Yet now he saw that he had only been reinforcing their blindness. Now he had the chance to truly lead them, to show them the one they had been searching for all along. He turned to Jesus, his voice steady despite the fear gripping his heart. I will go back. The moment the words left his lips, the light around them intensified, growing brighter and brighter until it consumed everything. He felt himself being pulled backward, as if being drawn through time and space. The presence of Jesus remained with him, but the heavenly realm faded, replaced by something else, a cold, sterile room, the sound of machines beeping, muffled voices. Then, with a sudden gasp, he opened his eyes. A shocked gasp filled the room as nurses and doctors froze in disbelief. His wife, who had been praying at his bedside, let out a cry, her hands flying to her mouth. His children clung to her, their faces pale with fear and confusion. He had been dead. The machines had flatlined. The doctors had pronounced him gone. Yet now, he was alive. The beeping of the monitors filled the air as Yusef's chest rose and fell, his body weak but undeniably breathing. He had returned, but as he looked into the wide, tear-filled eyes of his wife, He knew that his journey was far from over. His throat was dry, his body ached, but he had to speak. He had to tell them. With great effort, he turned to his wife, his voice barely a whisper. "It wasn't Allah. I saw Jesus." The room fell deathly silent. A cold tension settled over everyone present. His wife's expression twisted from relief to horror. His brother took a step back, shaking his head in denial. One of the doctors muttered a prayer under his breath, as if warding off a curse. Then the accusations began. "You were deceived. You are delirious. You have spoken blasphemy." His wife's voice cracked as she whispered, "Don't say that name again." But Yusuf knew he could never stay silent. Yusuf's heart clenched as the rejection began unfolding before him. He had known this would happen. Jesus had shown him this moment. Yet, experiencing it firsthand was like a knife to the soul. His wife, the woman he had loved and built a life with, now looked at him as if he were a stranger. His brother's eyes burned with anger, fists clenched at his sides. The others in the room either turned away or muttered prayers under their breath, refusing to even acknowledge what he had said. He was no longer one of them. Then came the final blow. His wife, her voice cold and trembling, whispered the words that would shatter his world. "If you say his name again, you are no longer my husband." The air left his lungs. This was it, the moment of ultimate cost. He could stay silent, pretend it had been a hallucination, cling to what little remained of his old life, or he could stand by the truth, no matter the price. His hands trembled as he took a slow breath. Then, in a voice steady and unshaken, he spoke the words that would change everything. "I cannot deny him. I saw Jesus, and he is Lord." A storm of voices erupted in the room, a mix of shock, anger, and disbelief. His brother lunged forward, grabbing him by the collar, his face red with fury. "Do you even hear yourself? You were dead. Allah brought you back, and you betray him with this blasphemy?" His grip tightened, and for the first time in his life, Yusuf saw hatred in his brother's eyes. His wife took a step back, her entire body trembling, tears spilling down her cheeks. She looked at him as if she no longer recognized the man she had married. "You are lost," she whispered, her voice hollow. "The devil has deceived you." The words stung more than he had expected, not because he believed them, but because he knew that she truly did. She wasn't rejecting him out of malice. She was afraid. She had been raised, as he had, to believe that questioning the faith was the gravest sin, that to turn away from Islam meant eternal damnation. But he had seen the truth. He had met Jesus. He could not unsee what had been revealed to him. His hands clenched into fists as he took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I am not lost," he said firmly, looking from face to face, meeting their accusing gazes without fear. "I was blind, but now I see." The words came from a place deep inside him, not rehearsed, not forced, but true. The room fell into a tense, suffocating silence. Then his father spoke. The old man had remained quiet until now, standing near the back, his expression unreadable. He had always been a man of deep conviction, an esteemed scholar, a leader in their community. It was from him that Yusuf had learned everything about Islam. His approval had once meant everything to him, but now, as his father stepped forward, there was only sorrow in his eyes. "You are no longer my son," he said, his voice calm but final. The words sent a sharp pain through Yusuf's chest, but he did not waver. His father turned to the others, shaking his head. "He has brought shame upon us all. He has betrayed our family, our faith, our people." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. This was not just personal rejection. He was being cast out, stripped of his identity, of his very place in the world. But even as his father's words landed like blows upon his heart, Yusuf felt something unexpected rising within him. Peace. He had feared this moment, dreaded this exact outcome, but now that it was happening, he was not afraid. He had lost his earthly family, but he had gained something far greater: the truth, the presence of Jesus, the assurance of eternity. He met his Father's gaze one last time, knowing there was nothing he could say to change his mind. "I love you," he said softly, but his Father had already turned away. Yusuf stood there, his heart heavy yet unshaken, as his father walked away. One by one the others followed, their faces filled with judgment, anger, and in some even sorrow. His wife was the last to turn her back on him, pausing at the doorway as if waiting for him to take it all back, to return to the man she had married. But that man was gone. The moment he had seen Jesus, his old life had died. He watched as she lowered her gaze, whispering a final broken goodbye, before disappearing through the door. And just like that, he was alone. Everything he had built, everyone he had loved, had been stripped away in the span of moments, but the weight of loss was nothing compared to the weight of truth. He knew that if he had denied Jesus, if he had turned back now, just to keep his family, he would have been denying the very purpose of his existence. He had found the truth, and no matter the cost, he could not abandon it. He sat back in his hospital bed, his body weak, but his spirit stronger than ever. He had lost his place in the world, but he had found his place in eternity. The days that followed were filled with whispers, stares, and a growing sense of danger. News of his betrayal spread quickly. The once respected imam, the man who had led countless prayers, had now become an outcast, a blasphemer, an apostate. He was no longer welcome in his own home, his own community. But rejection was not the only thing he faced. The first threat came just 2 nights after his release from the hospital. A note slipped under his door. "Leave now, or you will not live to see another sunrise." He stared at the words, his pulse steady, his mind clear. He had known this was coming. Jesus had shown him that persecution would follow, that his life would be at risk. But the question was never whether he would be afraid. The question was whether he would be faithful. He packed a small bag, knowing he had to leave. But he would not leave in silence. Before disappearing into the shadows, he wrote a message and left it behind. "I have seen the truth, and if you truly seek God, you will find it too." Yusuf fled into the night, his heart pounding, but his spirit unshaken. He had no home, no family, no safety, but he had Jesus. He moved from city to city, living in the shadows, but wherever he went, he carried a mission. He met in secret with those who had begun questioning, those who, like him, had spent their lives in devotion, but had started to feel that something was missing. He whispered the name that had cost him everything, Jesus, and for those who were willing to listen, it changed everything. Not all believed, but some did. He saw men who had once stood beside him in prayer, now secretly reading the gospel. He saw women, once veiled in fear, now lifting their hands in worship to the one who had set them free. He had lost everything, but through him others were finding the truth. The threats did not stop. He was hunted, pursued, labeled a traitor and a danger. Yet no matter how many times he was forced to flee, no matter how many times he was beaten or imprisoned, he did not stop speaking. The fire that had been ignited in him could not be extinguished. He knew what was coming. The persecution would increase, the deception would spread, and many would fall away. But Jesus had shown him something else, a great awakening. He had seen a movement that no force on earth could stop, an underground church growing where no one expected it, a revival in the hearts of those who had once been blind. And he knew he was part of it. As time passed, Yusuf's name faded from the places he once called home. His family mourned him as if he were dead, but he was more alive than ever. He never returned to the life he had before, but he never regretted his decision, because he had seen the truth. He had walked in darkness his whole life, convinced he knew God, only to find out that he had never truly known him. But now he did. And no rejection, no persecution, no threat could take that away from him. The world had cast him out, but the kingdom of God had welcomed him in. And so he continued. He spoke, he taught, he shared the truth with anyone who would listen. He did not know how much time he had, but that did not matter. The time was short, and the harvest was great. The world was changing, deception was growing, but the truth was still there for those willing to seek it, and for as long as he had breath, he would not be silent.